and welcome to episode 2 of Fair Tips Talks. We are here today to talk about the new tipping legislation that is coming in very shortly, that is going to be affecting the hospitality industry. Specifically, this episode number 2. So if you haven't seen number 1, please do go back so that you can have a look at the basics of what this new act means for hospitality. This particular episode is focusing in on agency workers, and I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Hugo Murphy, who is Operations Director at Stint, Andy Hamman, who is Director at the Tronc Advisor, and Andy Dempster, who is the Associate Director at GJC Advisory. And all 3 of these gentlemen actually have other strings to their bow within hospitality as well. So I'll just pass over to them, maybe starting with Andy Hamman, just to give anyone that's watching that doesn't know who you are, the information that they need to understand why you're on this webinar in the first place.
Hey, thanks, Katie. Good morning, everybody. I have been working in hospitality for something north of 25 years, employment tax advisor, but specialising in tips, troncs, service charge, gratuities. So this new allocation of tips act that's coming in next year is something that I'm totally immersed in, and really looking forward to just seeing how that is going to land with operators, and in particular talking today about agencies, which is a very emotive subject with not a lot of guidance so far.
Thank you. Hugo.
Hey everyone. So yeah, I've been at Stint for 4 years now. So Stint's a staffing solution for hospitality, connecting hospitality operators with our workforce. And I guess with my role at Stint in particular, I look after all of our workers. And at the moment, we're building towards a solution which, for the legislation, will be compliant, but also transparent and fair for our workers. But more importantly, or as importantly, a good solution for the operators as well.
Thank you. And Andy Dempster.
Hi, good morning. I've worked in, like my colleague Andy, worked in hospitality for almost 30 years, crikey. And I currently work with an advisory practice. So we work with a lot of, excuse me, independent hospitality business, hotels, restaurants across the UK. And the reason I'm here is I'm clearly going to be asked by my clients for advice moving forward on this legislation and how it's going to impact them in their, being compliant and doing the best by their teams. And so, yes, this is something that's definitely going to crop up over the next several months within my client base for sure.
Thank you. Now, Andy Hamman, as the I'm calling my resident expert, could you just give us, because just in case there's anyone out there who maybe didn't watch the episode 1, although they really should go back and watch that, just a brief overview of what the Act is, and then specifically, just again, very briefly, what does that mean for agency workers, for the gig economy, etc., however you want to phrase that?
Okay, so the Act, the overarching message is about fairness and transparency, and ensuring that any tip that is generated in a site, in a restaurant, in a hotel, in a bar, is passed on to the staff in that site. So it's all about 100% of tips must be distributed. It's there's no question that operators, if they have been retaining any elements of that money to cover their costs, excuse me, in processing that money, that has to stop. It's 100% means 100%, and the money must be paid out fairly quickly, within a month of it being generated, so that it can't be carried forward and used at a later date. One of the key elements that's come out of this new Act, sort of bolting on to those normal practices of passing those tips to the workers of the employing business, is the government is now saying that any agency workers, so temporary workers that sort of a host business, host employer is using to supplement its main workforce, must also be given a share of those tips and must also be allocated those tips in a fair and transparent manner. So there should be equality between an employed worker and a temporary agency worker.
Okay, so Andy, it seems to me like this parity between fully employed workers and agency workers hasn't really been seen before. So what kind of issues is that going to throw up for the operator?
So I think the main challenge for me is the legislation has provided for either the host employer to process these tips, basically put the agency workers on their payroll and pay the money out either from the employer or through a tronc arrangement. So they're basically one in the same, worker or agency worker. However, it also says that you can basically take that lump of money, if you like, and pass it over to the agency and say, you process it. Obviously, they're on your payroll. It might make more sense for you to just make this as an addition. And I think for me, the challenge is, what's the better way of doing that? And whereas it may seem simplistic for the host employer to do it, they may not want to put these people on their payroll. But equally, agencies are not used to this. I would say generally not used to this new requirement, probably don't have a concept of what a tronc arrangement is. So how are they going to process it? Will they just process it as pay? Will they set up a tronc? Will they outsource it as a tronc? There's national insurance issues that come with that. And then, of course, and I'll pass over to Andy and especially Hugo on this, is around sort of the costings of this, because, you know, what's that agency worker being paid already? And then you've got the tips now on top. What does that overall package look like? Is it inflating rates and things like that? So that's the sort of concerns I think are out there and are yet to be ironed out.
So Hugo, then, from you're nodding, you're nodding at Andy's concerns. Where does that sit for you at Stint? Then, you know, how are you looking at that?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for sure. I think to Andy's point around agencies maybe not having as much knowledge and experience of the tronc, you know, market. That's definitely true, and there's been a journey of kind of upskilling in knowledge and context around tronc in general, and particularly around the legislation that's coming in. I think for us, the key point here is, or one of the key points is just reducing the burden for the operator as much as possible. We don't want operators to feel put off from, you know, working with agencies as a result of this new legislation. So for us, a big part is building a solution which kind of mitigates the admin for them, and we're in the process of that at the moment. And I think out of the, you know, two options of the stint, or they're called stinters, I might call them stinters throughout this webinar by mistake, but throughout the kind of the option of the stinters being paid by either you know, the operator or us. I think, you know, for us instinctively it makes sense to keep them on our payroll and not add a lot of confusion by having to add them to the operator's payroll. And then it's just about, you know, creating a seamless way for the operator to let us know how much they feel like, you know, according to their tip distribution policy, the stinters should be paid, and for them to transfer that or send that money to us. And then we will deal with processing that money for the stinter, adding it to their payroll, making it as a clear kind of line item on their pay slip, so it's clear and transparent, you know, how many tips are being paid, where that tip came from, and so on. But I think a kind of high level principle we're kind of approaching this with is making sure we build the solution like with the operator, and we're working with them, not just going off and doing it ourselves. And as I said, with the objective being to just reduce the admin burden on them.
Okay. Andy Dempster, then. So, you know, Andy Hamann mentioned earlier that you'd have a view on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the Act is, you know, broadly welcome, and I think it's going to be a great thing for the industry. And like I say, producing that sort of transparency and fairness. I think, like most government policy, it's devil's in the detail, and I think it's left an awful lot for the industry to sort of mop up, interpret, and obviously logistically sort of iron out these intricacies and nuances. Certainly, you know, the challenges with, in particular, you know, if you're outsourcing team, and you know, I know a lot of clients are going to be, well, how do we know what they've earned? You know, obviously there are there is nuance between gratuities and service charge. You know, how does that get interpreted? Obviously, service charge is discretionary. Was it paid? Wasn't it paid? So I think there's a lot for, you know, operators to think about. I'm sure, as hospitality always does, it's very innovative, and obviously will absolutely tackle all of these issues. But like I say, I think, the government have basically said, yes, let's, this is what's going to happen, 100%, which is great. I think certainly for hospitality, and I think the attraction and one of the other challenges that we've obviously struggled with as an industry in attracting talent is a very, very positive thing. Because once the industry is forced to do something, it always comes up with a solution. But I think there's going to be some real devil in the detail sort of moments, and like I say, third-party providers like Stint, I think are going to have to be really box clever. So I almost feel a little bit sorry for these guys, because obviously, there's a lot to overcome. But like I say, I'm sure we will.
I think it's really interesting because we're as hospitality businesses, we are so used to thinking on our feet, and especially since the pandemic, now we can turn on a dime, right? So, we're very capable of doing it. We had a conversation in last week's webinar about how the timing wasn't ideal. Can you guys see any scenarios where this does become a bit of a nightmare for a hospitality business? Are there any sort of areas where you're looking at where you're thinking, I'm just not sure how that can be done?
I think one thing that jumps out at me is if we go back to the overarching concept of fairness and transparency. If you say, well, I'm allocating these tips to the agency cohort in a fair and transparent manner, or the tronc master meets all the legislation, and then you pass that money over. If the agency doesn't then follow that allocation structure that you deem to be fair and transparent, and changes it, and you may not even know this, of course, how does that ripple back up to the operator and say, well, there's a liability or a challenge there that my tips haven't, as an agency worker, my tips haven't been allocated to me fairly because I'm talking to my counterpart who's an employee of the operator, and she says, I've got this much and I'm doing the same job and I've got this much. Well, that wasn't the intention, but it's changed somewhere through its journey. So where does that who's responsible for that, and how is it going to be policed or regulated, or is it something that is perhaps overthought? Am I overthinking that? But given that the wider part of the Act does also provide for workers to ask how their tips have been generated and where they've come from and how decisions have been made of how they've been allocated to them, they have that right under the new legislation to get that information. The savvy ones, at some point, somebody is going to say, this doesn't match. So
yeah, this doesn't seem fair to me. How's it come about?
In the bustling heart of hospitality, every service has its value. But beyond the impeccable service, there's a world where fairness and finance meet. We've helped businesses recover over £50 million in national insurance contributions.
From precision-focused tronc advice, masterful tronc master services to rigorous compliance checks, we're your ally in the tipping ecosystem.
And because we believe in a world where every penny and every principle counts, here's our offer to you.
Mention Fair Tips 1 when reaching out, and you'll get an exclusive hour of free consultation with Andy Hammond. With the Tronc Advisor, it's more than just tipping. It's about transforming the way hospitality thrives. The Tronc Advisor, where every tip leads to a greater journey.
Yeah. And I think also, it's like anything, isn't it? You've got the agencies, you've got the people like Stint who are going to do the right thing. They're reputable people to be dealing with, and they wouldn't want to put anyone that works for them or the hospitality industry reputation from a wider point of view at risk. However, you have bad apples in every barrel. I think I might be mixing some metaphors there, but you know what I mean. There is that chance that perhaps the less salubrious agencies. Is there a danger that they could be sort of creaming off the top, so to speak?
I guess just to add to what Andy said there and kind of partly answer your question, Katie, I think it's important that the agencies are transparent, not just to the worker, but then back to the operator in the payments and how they themselves have distributed the money. More as a sense of, this is confirmation that the way that you wanted to distribute the tips to the workers, we've done it, and here's proof. And I think that's important, just to make sure that there's that confidence that we are carrying out what the distribution that they wanted. So I think that's quite an important feature.
And presumably there is a tech solution to that, where the operator can have some kind of thing where they can log in, they can see where we wanted it to go like X, Y, and Z, and then they can log in to see that happens. Obviously, that's another complexity for the agencies to have to deal with, but presumably it's possible.
Yeah, and I think maybe that would sit across the range of features that we're considering as part of the solution, as maybe a nice to have rather than a must have from a compliancy perspective. But I think it's all of those nice to have features which are going to make the difference for the operator in particular. And I think maybe that could make the difference between which agencies the operators decide to work with. It's how easy are you making this for us? How transparent are you being for us? And that's important for us. And we've got a while till, well, I say a while and it will suddenly creep up on us, but a while till we actually have to get this in place. But we're kind of wanting to look at it now, because I don't know how involved everyone was in the right to work digitization and kind of towards the back end of last year, but that again was another example of a lot of what felt like unanswered questions till quite late on, and then we were suddenly finding ourselves trying to build a solution really quickly, and we left it too late. And we still got a great solution in place, but it was a good experience for us to think, okay, let's start really early for this one and make sure all parties are happy.
Okay, and then from an agency worker's point of view, and Andy and I discussed this again on episode 1. It seems to me that broadly speaking, in fact, almost wholly speaking, this act is going to be a positive for the hospitality worker, which in turn, working for a research agency that looks at consumer, will be a positive for the consumer, because if the agency workers are happier, or if they're being paid more and they're of better standard, etc., then obviously they're going to be giving a better service to the customer. Do we think that this will change how agency workers feel about working in the industry? Do we think that they'll have different expectations or different concerns, different motivations? Andy Dempster, do you want to give me your opinion on how we think the agency workers' viewpoint might change from this act?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's fantastic that agency workers are going to get their fair share of obviously their tips and gratuities and service charges, etc. I think that's a really positive thing. I think it is going to be interesting, because I think it will throw up sort of managing expectations of what people are entitled to, and people's interpretation of what that is and what that looks like. I think on the downside, I think it could lead to some sort of misunderstanding, where there's probably going to be a few more calls to ACAS and interpretations like that. We saw that with furlough, where people felt they were entitled to it and they'd missed a cut-off point, and we couldn't give them furlough because we just couldn't process them, and they somehow felt we were holding things back. And so there's always going to be the downside, but I think largely it's going to be very, very positive. I think the reality is, I think certainly London will be massively impacted, obviously because there's a huge service charge culture, and I think there are some really unscrupulous operators out there that a light's going to be shone on them. And I think if there's better working practices, there's a lot of great operators as well doing the right things, going above and beyond, and I think that's more the norm. Certainly that's what I've found, but I think it's going to shine a spotlight on all operations, and this, again, to Andy's point, this fairness and transparency. And if that's for obviously employed workers and the agency workers, I think that can only be a very positive thing, because one of the, I guess, stereotypes or tropes of the hospitality worker is that it's low paid, which is a nonsense. I know some of my waiters and some of my restaurants, they're on probably £18-20 an hour, with tips and service charges, you top that up, there's actually a very decent salary, certainly if you're starting out as well. So I think that's going to hopefully blow some of that nonsense out of the water, where actually, because whether it be being forced to do this, the industry has to do the right thing. And my hope is that as an outcome of that it will attract talent, which is probably the biggest challenge the industry faces, above and beyond VAT and obviously food, all the inflationary pressures that we faced certainly over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah. The living perma crisis, as I call it. Okay, and the positive for this as well, another positive for me, is that it may well help the relationship between agency workers and operators evolve in a positive manner. Not just because the workers are feeling like they're being correctly and fairly remunerated, but actually also because they will surely feel a bit more part of a team. In my view, does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, Katie. And I also echo, everything Andy was saying there about it being a positive movement for workers on the whole, and we're really pleased about it at Stint. I think Stint as a kind of agency model doesn't operate like the kind of typical agency where we provide workers for ad hoc shifts here and there. Our workers kind of go into businesses week in, week out, and become very embedded in the team. And so I think this legislation really fits in nicely to that, because our stinters now are going to, they already would feel like being part of the team, but now this will reinforce that, knowing that they're getting their fair share of tips, when otherwise it might feel like, hold on, I'm basically part of the team, why am I not getting any tips here? So I think it's a really positive movement from that perspective. And hopefully the core team themselves, the part and full-time employees at the business, hopefully they'll feel the same, and they'll feel like, what, these stinters coming in every week, they do deserve their fair share here. So I think hopefully it will be a positive movement for the relationship between the workers.
Hey you, did you know that Tip Jar is 100% compliant with the new legislation? Well, we are. We can do pretty much anything. Tips, tronc, you name it. Not only that, but your staff are going to get their money 6 times faster than a traditional method. No national insurance contributions for you, full transparency for all of your staff, and absolutely no more administrative headaches. Find out more today.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when it comes to the operators, of course, alongside this act comes some, I would imagine, quite complex budgeting and financial planning considerations with regards to agency staff. What are operators going to need to start thinking about when it comes to agency staff specifically and this act? Either of the Andys?
I just wanted to reiterate Hugo's point. I think the great thing about the act is including agency staff is that there isn't going to become this temptation of a 2-tier employee where actually, it's a little bit cheaper for us to have the agency staff. So I think that's fantastic, and I think it's really good they've been included. I think companies, certainly the operators, are going to have to incorporate, obviously what will be perceived as additional costs. Certainly, obviously 100% is going to the team members, and obviously, as we know, commissions on credit card charges, etc. That's going to be a concern to a lot of operators, I'm sure, where it's going to be perceived as another additional cost. But like I say, they're going to obviously have to incorporate that into their future planning. Certainly that's probably been the biggest concern that's been raised myself. Obviously, that they're always given, I guess, 99% of what was certainly on the service charge side of thing, that's been distributed fairly across the teams. But obviously there is a cost to doing that, certainly when because obviously the more that goes through on the credit card charge, the commission is there on the transaction. And so I think they're going to have to factor that in. That's certainly what's been discussed with myself. That's been the big one. It's going to cost me more money. And obviously, if this was just the only thing that's happened recently, I think we'll suck that up. Obviously, with everything else, certainly energy being the biggest impact on hospitality recently, I think it'll be seen as a blow. So I think, a lot of operators, certainly out of London, this is another cost. But I think once they get over that initial sort of shock, they'll embrace it. But like I say, the long term, if they, this is what I'm talking about, the long term, think strategically, more people applying for work in the industry, that's a positive thing. And actually turnover is lessened, where you're not saying that's going to affect productivity, consistency, and that can only be a positive thing. So it's about how you come at it. But I guess to answer your question directly, they're going to have to factor it in big time, whether that's employed or agency. The cost is the cost, and they're going to have to factor that in on the long term.
Agreed. And Hugo, in what ways can operators and agencies work hand in hand to make sure that this new act is implemented in a way that gives shared benefits rather than shared pain points, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's kind of two key, I guess, approaches or principles from that perspective of making sure it's a kind of harmonious journey for operators and agencies. And one of them is, making sure that we build the solutions alongside operators. We're not doing it in isolation, and we are working like doing it literally hand in hand in meetings with different types of operators, so we can get a sense of different perspectives and different types of ways of doing it. And therefore making sure that when it comes to rolling out the solution, it's as close as possible to there not being pain points, and everyone's kind of feeling kind of happy about it. But yeah, just I guess an understanding that it probably will be quite painful in the first month or two, but we'll iterate early on and get to a good place, and just make sure we keep on talking to operators and getting feedback and thinking about how to improve it. So yeah, I'm feeling good about it at the moment, but maybe ask me again.
I was about to say, I'll come back to you in a couple of months. Conversation then. I think it's about, isn't it, listen, whenever you introduce something new to an industry or even to a business, you're going to have to iron out some bumps. It's very rare that anything that involves our government and technology is going to be completely smooth sailing. So I guess we have to almost be accepting that we need to be having very honest conversations between the operators and the agencies as to where those bumps are and whose role that is to smooth them over. Andy H, as I'm now going to call you, the question I have for you is, because I'm sitting here thinking, right, this is great for the industry in the long term, short term, bit of a pain, but what I haven't really got my head around is, what does a fair and transparent tip allocation for agency workers look like? And I would imagine that any operator out there that's watching this suddenly just went, yes, that's the question I want to ask too, because at the moment it's very much assumptive, correct?
Yeah, totally. And I think that segues quite nicely into the code of practice, which I think we should touch upon. So that is currently in draft, yet to be made public, but imminent, we are promised. End of summer, we were told. So we're getting there. It's got to be a matter of weeks to then allow for a necessary consultation. The code of practice promises to give operators and stakeholders the tools to implement this act, practically, commercially, pragmatically. So it's going to talk, well, we hope it's going to tell us what does the government consider fairness to be? Is it the standard interpretation of fairness? One would hope they'll give some useful live examples of what's fair and equally what's not fair. I think that would be very helpful. And in the same way, transparency. And then, as I say, what is been mooted around is that there will be quite a significant section of this code of practice that covers the agency element, and hopefully will give a lot of guidance and, iron out some concerns, give operators and agencies alike, that information that they can then, like Hugo was saying, build into their, what they're building, build into their systems, tweak them, and give them some surety that they're not going to be sort of challenged for falling foul of this. So I think, to sum that up, the next key stage of this is to get this code of practice out so that we can see it and see what direction it's going in. And as I say, it will go to consultation. So if there's uncertainty in there, or things don't make sense, or there's things missing, so both Andy and Hugo might say, well, hang on a minute, but what about? That's the opportunity to do it before it becomes sort of a finished document early in the new year. So that for me is the next step, and what a lot of my clients are saying: when are we going to get the code of practice?
What I'd like to finish on is some trends sort of commentary, really, because I think that we are a constantly evolving industry, as we know, and it's been revolutionized in the last few years. Do we think, and Andy Dempster, if you could perhaps give me your thoughts on this, do we think that there will be a shift in agency worker trends because of this legislation, because of this act coming in? I mean, whether that's how agencies will behave, whether that's how agency workers will behave, or whether it's how operators will hire. What are your thoughts on how we could see some trends shift in this area?
It's going to be really interesting. I mean, I think, we all start with the individual. It's going to be, if the individual worker wants to remain as an agency worker, obviously that's, Hugo attest to this. Obviously, there's people that enjoy that it's good for them. In the same way, that's how the gig economy has taken off. People want, authorship over what they do and where they work, and they want to maybe work in a couple of places. So I think that's going to dictate, that forward movement, in terms of it could actually increase the amount of people that want to be an agency worker, because obviously there's benefits now, added benefit to doing that. They don't have to attach themselves to any one business. So that could be a positive thing, which obviously will increase demand for agencies. Could be very good for Hugo. Yes, I do foresee, the industry's been given a few challenges, shall we say, over recent years. I think the operators will be like, this is going to be very, very complicated. We'll do away with working so much with agencies because it's going to be a faff. I think there'll be an element of that initially, like we've discussed, those bumps in the road. But ultimately, I think it's going to be it'll be the market that dictates how this goes. If the individual worker decides that it's more beneficial for them to be an agency worker, then that's how you get your workers in hospitality. Then that's what's going to drive that particular trend. I think it's going to be interesting. I wish I had a crystal ball to sort of say which way it's going to go, but I think the industry will adapt. I think I think it will be regionalised as well. I think as we know, tipping in certain parts of the country, certain grats, is very different to service charge in the rest of the country. So I think certainly that's going to be interesting, how that affects the individual in terms of how they want to work, and whether that's agency or in-house.
Andy H, your thoughts on how this might tip and change? See what I did there? Didn't mean to do that, sorry. How this might sort of change the balance of how the hospitality industry works?
I think, following on from Andy, sort of to reiterate quite a bit of that I think it may change the usage of agencies, and that might be an increase or a decrease. But either way, I think it's positive, because it's going to force, if that's the right word, dialogue and those channels of communication between the relevant stakeholders. So between an operator and an agency and the worker themselves. So I think that's positive. And yeah, there may be some rocky times to start with, and people withdraw from the idea. But I think Andy's right. You know, that some of these workers, this is what they want to do. They want the freedom and the flexibility. I don't think that's going to change. And in actuality, if they're now, you know, I'm doing this job, but I'm now going to get tips as well, and there's that alignment with being a worker. Why should I want to move over to permanent employment? I'm pretty much getting the same treatment and the same benefits out of this, with that freedom and flexibility that I want as an agency or gig worker. So my honest view is I think it'll be positive. I do, and I think it'll settle.
Okay, well, so in summary, we do think that the new legislation, when it comes to agency workers, is going to be a positive. Like anything that comes into any industry, but specifically the hospitality industry over the last few years, with all of the other external pressures that are going on, there may well be some bumps in the road that need to be ironed out. I think that the feeling I was getting here is that the idea of collaboration between operators and agencies is absolutely crucial. So it's crucial that a lot of talking is done in the initial stages to make sure that things are being introduced and initiatives being introduced in the way that they should be. I think we also need to understand that, you know, I think Andy H mentioned it's very much not an option. This is now something that is coming in. It is happening. We need to understand as operators how we absorb the cost, but also understand that actually this could be a positive in the long term for the relationship between operators and customers, because of the relationship positivity that will come through between operators and agencies. So a lot to think about there. Anyone out there who's got any questions, I'm sure there'll be a way to contact us on social media. Thank you so much for listening to this episode 2 of Fair Tips Talks. And thank you so much to Andy Dempster, Andy Hammond, and Hugo Murphy for joining me on this session.
Ready for the next episode? Well, you'll have to wait. Episode 3 is launching on the 31st of October, where we'll be talking to Chantal Wilson, Philip Eales, Paddy Gardner, and Matt Goch, all about the new legislation and putting people first. Still have any burning questions? Well, that's no worries. Tweet us at tipjar_tweet or find us on LinkedIn. See you then.